Hello, everyone. No introduction needed. I'm Super. And today I want to talk about if stats matter. And in particular, we're going to look at the results of Invitational, which should be the 20 best teams in the world competing in Rainbow Six. This is going to be a weekly or maybe bi weekly series I do just discussing strategy, game philosophy, anything like that relating strictly to Rainbow Six competitive play. So you may notice in the top right, I've laid out some things, and quickly I'll just go through this and how I define them. Obviously, in this game, many teams could have different ways of how they play the game, how they identify roles on a team, what they think is the best, and I'm going to explain or try to show you why I think the way that my team plays and a lot of teams at this tournament play is in fact the best. So the question of do stats matter, I think, is an important one because obviously you see everywhere people argue one way or the other. And I would say, yes, they matter for some, but not necessarily for all. So what roles would stats matter for? Number one, your entry player. Your entry player usually should be your top fragger or your second top frag, have a lot of entry engagements, and generally be the spearhead for your team's attacks. The secondary entry player is the person who will follow up the entry player in these engagements. He's there for the trade. More than likely, he'll end up with more kills or better stats than the entry player because in a way he baits the entry player. And maybe he won't have as many opening kills. And then your flex player, that's going to be like the sledge, maybe a third kind of frag role. That's the person who is maybe not going to pop off as much as your two entries, but that person is somebody who's going to put up generally pretty respectable stats, but not necessarily be on the forefront of entry engagements. And then you have your support player, and by support player, I'm considering this like a hard support player. This is your breach. This is your person who plants the bomb. For a lot of teams, this is your IGL. This is the person that is going to be an enabler. I like to call an enabler, which is sort of a job of a support player to make the other players around him better, help the team win, even at the expense of his own stats. Basically, he's the ultimate team player. And then we have a secondary support player or a flex. What that may be is a second hard breach if it's needed for a map like Clubhouse, something like that. Or a flex, because you won't always need another support. You could always just bring another gun, depending on the map. And then down here, I just have IGL, because obviously, depending on your team, IGL could be numerous roles. It could be your entry player. It could be your support player. It could be anyone on the team, however your team works. For me, myself, I IGL from a hard support role. I just find it easier. That's not the case for every team. Obviously, every team has their own structure. And then if we go down to defense, we have a roamer and a secondary roamer. Again, your roamer is probably going to be one of your better statistical players, one of your better entry engagement players. And you have a secondary roamer. Now, this could be a lurker. This could be somebody who roams with the roamer. But generally, this is another player who is probably going to have better stats than the main roamer. Because the person who gets in the entry engagements, they're not always going to have the best stats. For them to have the best stats, they have to be winning a ton of entry engagements, right? Usually it's your lurkers, which we could put into the secondary entry or a flex, or your secondary roamers who kind of bait the initial pressure player for stats. And then we have your bridge or a flex. What we call a bridge is this is somebody who, if you're roaming, they'll kind of play in between sight and the roamers to maybe cut off if somebody's trying to walk up a staircase in between them, to stop somebody from jumping in a window behind them. They're there for assistance and to just cover the roamers' backs so they don't get cut off from sight. And then we have a flex or a secondary support. Again, a flex could be anything. Could be another roamer, could be a lurker. Secondary support might be something like a maestro. Obviously, every team nowadays probably going to be running like a smoke, something with a shotgun. So your secondary support player could sometimes be a mute, could sometimes be a maestro, could be a Cade. And obviously, those are all powerful operators that have the ability to get kills. So they're not exactly an anchor But they can fill that role if you need. And then we have an anchor. An anchor, that's going to be your smoke. That's the person who generally is playing for their life to save utility, to burn time at the end. Now, depending on your region and the way your team plays, obviously this anchor role can be played more aggressively, but in that case, I wouldn't really call it an anchor. In NA, I think a lot of teams run this role as an anchor, whereas like in LATAM, for instance, the smoke is generally a pretty powerful operator in terms of fragging power. It's just the way you play it. So now that we've kind of established the roles and how we think they should work, I thought let's look at Invitational and see which teams are playing the kind of, this kind of format of team, and if this is the best way to play it, if it's not, and how much these stats really matter. So I thought we'll start at the bottom and just go up. And for Team 1, we're going to see that they were eliminated in groups with 4 points. Now, they did actually win 2 games and lose 2 games. And they're going to be an outlier here, actually, I believe, as we go forward. Because if you look in their group, they actually had a better record than 2 of the teams that qualified ahead of them. The problem was that they went into the third map to win. They didn't have clean 2-0s. However, if we look at their team here on SiEgeGG, and we look at their statistical output, what do we have? We have the entry player, plus 24, plus 13 entries, 27 entry engagements. We have the secondary entry player, or entry, you could flip these two possibly. More than likely, Almo's actually the secondary entry, because we do see KDS with more entry engagements. He's also on traditionally more entry operators. And we see Alamo on the smoke, which I know he doesn't exclusively play smoke. This is obviously just a example of, 1, LATAM playing smoke more aggressively, and 2, he plays a lot of different operators. As you see, they have multiple smoke players. But so they have this formula that we've talked about where they have these 2 players who are basically boosted up statistically far above the rest of their team and entry-wise. And then we have the flex player. This is your middleman. This is the person who's going slightly positive, obviously struggling a little bit on entry, and, that's just a lackluster performance and not getting a lot of work in terms of objective. And then we have Neskin and Lagonis. Lagonis obviously playing a hard support role on the breach and the smoke, 10 plants. And we have Neskin, negative 16, no plants. So what is the outlier here for Team 1? The fact that they lost in groups, even though they're kind of playing this idea or the style that we're talking about in terms of you have your support player, a secondary support / flex, a normal flex, and then your 2 entry players. So you look at this, Lagonis is negative 28 with 10 plants, right? You could say he didn't do his job. He wasn't enabling them enough, but he was. These 2 players were both together plus 40 overall. So once again, we see right here following that enabler method. And yeah, they didn't make it out of groups, but you could argue they should have. They had a better record than the other teams in their groups. So let's look at BDS now. BDS, they were 1-3. If we go to BDS here, obviously, we had a very strange situation with them, so it's hard to look at this from a normal point of view. But they have Brid, who's arguably the best support player in the world, and he led their team with plus 15 with 14 plants. Now, this is an outlier. This player in particular is an outlier because he's arguably not only the best support player in the world, but maybe the best player in the world. He's always putting up numbers, even though he's on this, this hard support role. The outlier for them comes to here. So Shaiko and Alims, they are playing that entry role. I believe Alims is also IGLing. But they weren't really doing effective work on the entry, and they weren't being, I guess how you would say, enabled. Whereas we see Renshiro, Bios obviously standing in as a coach, and Rafal all struggle. So when you see something like this, Brid, top of the board in plant, top of the board in kills, his entry players beneath him struggling on entry, and then below that the flex and the flex and the secondary flex, or the secondary support, all struggling. Is this a question of Brid not enabling his entry players enough, or Rafal or Renshiro or Bios not enabling the players here? Because as we see, this formula did not work for BDS. Having your hard support player be your top fracker while also having the most plants is not a formula to succeed. So the question is, if Britt did worse statistically but focused more so on his team improving, obviously normally I think these guys play better. And this definitely probably had something to do with Rafal and Bios. But is the individual success of Britt in this situation potentially causing a less team success because nobody is really being enabled to do much from what we see? Now, I don't think we need to focus too much on BDS here because I think that was obviously an interesting situation for them. But if we go to Cyclops now, let's look at them. Cyclops, here we have their hard support player. This would be an enabler. Negative 27, 4 plants. Their secondary, Anaton, he's a shield player. 3 plants, negative 26. So what they were doing, basically, is they're not enabling, but they're also not doing as much objective work as they need. Together, combined, they only had 7 plants. We see Gatorada, who you could say is their their secondary support, because Black Ray using these roles would be the flex player. Both of their entry players basically struggled. Negative 12 combined on the entry, negative 36 and negative 16, with their flex player being the only positive player. So once again, we go back and say they weren't being enabled by the support players. You can live with these numbers from your support player if these numbers are much better from your entries. So what do I see here? Not enough objective work and not enough work objectively from Anatone and Suzuk to help Gatorada and Ayage to be successful. Now, we can say or argue that maybe these players are just not performing up to capability, and I think that would take some VOD review to look into. But this is another team not successful, not following the formula, right? And that's what we want to focus on here. And then for Sandbox, find them. Same situation. Nobody on their team positive. Their entry player actually was positive in entry. They as a team only had 7 plants. Their flex player was negative 19, and I assume this is their secondary entry player, negative 3 on entry, but negative 1 overall. And this is another team where they're not boosting anybody up. Nobody's really being enabled. So you could say, in a way, maybe they are being enabled because if you look at it, they're following the formula. Their 2 entry players are their 2 highest rated players. Most entry engagements. Their flex players, their 3rd highest rated player, entry engagements. And then their 2 support players are the lowest. The problem is that these players are either 1, not being enabled enough, or 2, not playing well enough to take advantage of that system. But if we look at this from a pure numbers perspective, they are following within the formula. They just didn't play well enough. So those are the teams that were eliminated from groups. So now, rather than focus on groups, let's just look at the general placings, and we'll just go top to bottom. So we have Rogue and Navi in NIP. So we have Rogue up here. So for Rogue, once again, we have Aces, Finka, Malusi. He's going to be an entry player. We have Leon, an entry player. 36 entry engagements, 32 entry engagements. Cryan on flex, 26 entry engagements. And then we have Prano on hard support and Rips playing the secondary support. They're following the formula. Yes, they are. They have a decent amount of plants. Hard support has 11 plants as well as 5 clutches. So Prano doing his job. You see the negative 17? That's okay. All of his other stats back this up. So where do we see the struggle from Rogue? Leon, as an entry player, is negative 14, negative on entry. Aces, as an entry player, negative 4 overall, neutral on entry. Rips, as your secondary support player, negative 30. So your entry players aren't doing well enough to be enabled to play this kind of formula. And then your secondary support player is negative 30. This player should never be that negative in this role because this is a stat for your heart support player, right? So it shouldn't, it's reversed in a way that the heart support player is doing better than your secondary support, because this player is not always on support. So in a way, we do see the same formula, but they're not being enabled to have that success. So it comes down to what is preventing the success. Is it the droning? Is it just not playing well enough? Here we could see clearly maybe the entry engagement difference for their entries. And then we have the outlier of Rips having a very poor rating, very poor statistical performance on a role that he should not do that bad. He can go negative on that secondary support role because at times he will be playing secondary support, but he only has one plant and he's just not doing well enough. So then if we go look at NIP do play within the system we're talking about. We have Psycho. He's also the IGL for this team. Muzi and Pino all over 100 kills. Pino, 41 entry engagements. Psycho, 41 entry engagements. And then Muzi, 28 entry engagements. These are their fraggers and flex. We have Julio, negative 16 with 1 plant. And Kamikaze, negative 13 with 12 plants. So, once again, we see a team playing within that formula. And what do we notice? The entry engagements for this team are not great. Psycho, negative 11 on entry. Muzi, negative 2 on entry. Pino, plus 1 on entry. Muzi, negative 1 overall. Psycho, negative 6 overall. So when you look at negative 13 and negative 16 from these two roles, your secondary support and your support role, you're not really blaming these two. You're blaming these. You expect more production from the top 3 roles if you're playing this kind of system. So you might initially look at this and say, Julio's negative 16, only 1 plant. What are you doing? But Julio's holding flank. He's playing a secondary support role. He's potentially enabling or attempting to enable his entry players who are struggling to entry. So then we can go look for Navi. And on Navi, we have an interesting situation here. So we have Secretly, who's negative 43 overall, and he is playing the hard support role, but he only has 6 plants. Nathan has 7 plants, which is more than the hard support role, and better stats while playing operators that are not necessarily always support. Nathan is not always support. You could say maybe he's secondary support, although Saves is actually playing secondary support roles. And Secretly has 35 entry engagements here. How or why does your support player, assuming he's the support player, have 35 entry engagements? We go to Doki. He's playing the entry role. He's negative 4 on entry with 64 entry engagements. Saves has 28 entry engagements. Nathan has 16 entry engagements, sort of playing the flex or maybe the secondary. I guess Saves is probably the secondary entry because he does have the most entry engagements, really. Or Blur. Blur's got 39 entry engagements. So what's weird about Navi is they do have these 2 players who are being boosted up, but they're negative 16 on entry. And then Blur is negative 18 on the flex, while Nathan is negative 17, also seemingly on a flex. And they're all struggling on entry besides Blur. But once again, the outlier comes down to, in this instance, the support. Because Secretly is negative 43 with 35 entry engagements, which is a ton to be in as a support player. I don't know how you have 35 entry engagements, but only 6 plants. So how are you going negative 43, but you're only planting 6 times? Is he dying every single time he's planting the bomb? That seems unlikely. So when you look at Navi, in a way, they are playing the enable style, but they have lackluster production from their support player, lackluster production from their flex player, and lackluster production from their secondary flex player. And then their entries, even though, yes, stat-wise they're positive, they're having lackluster results as an entry. And this is particularly concerning because if Saves is, in the theory, the secondary entry player, so he's trading Doki most of the time, he's just not getting any entry engagement success at all. And he should honestly probably be better statistically trading Doki if Doki has 64 entry engagements. So Navi, once again, they are playing within that system of the entry, secondary entry, flex, and 2 supports. But their support in this instance, their flex in this instance, and their secondary support in this instance, letting them down. So if we go here and then look for M&M Gaming, following somewhat of the same situation. We have Neo. He's going to be the hard support, although he only has 2 plants at -24. Nello on the support role at -5 with 8 plants. And then we have Tyrant as an entry, 31 entry engagements. Usus, 18 entry engagements. Solotov, 33 entry engagements. Solotov and Usus boosted up, both +8, +6, positive on the entry. Where does it fall apart? Tyrant, -4 as the flex player with 31 entry engagements. Neo, only 2 plants, but -24. So you look at Eminem, they're playing within that system, but what's the fault? What's going on here? They're not being enabled enough to make a difference. They are positive overall. They are positive on entry. But Neo not playing the hard support role, as he only has 2 plants. He's even main operator of Jaeger on defense, going -24. And Tyrant playing this entry operator, negative on entry and -4 overall. So what's the issue? You don't have your flex player in kind of this third role. Probably should be closer to even. And then Neo, who's not your main bomb planter, is much below the rest of the team. So they're within the system, but clearly you see where they're falling off, where they're missing the correct statistics, I guess you'd look at. So we can go 9 to 12 now. Let's look at Elevate, Furia, and we'll start with Elevate. Elevate's a very interesting team. They play very strange, but if we look at them, their 2 support players are on the bottom at -24 and -14. What's very interesting is Napew, who I wouldn't necessarily call him a support player. He's a secondary support. He plays a lot of operators. He had 60 entry engagements, which is a ton. At a -14 rating. Their hard support player is SUPR. Even 20 entry engagements, honestly, is a lot. And he's going to have 8 plants. This is a team that obviously didn't plant the bomb a lot. They only had 11 plants and 17 maps as an entire team. And then we have Onigiri, who's +20 overall, with 67 entry engagements. He's just -17. And then Nerix, +1, +3, playing kind of that secondary entry operator. And DCH also kind of playing the secondary entry operator flex. So Elevate, once again, they are staying within this system. What's interesting about Elevate is Onigiri is doing a fantastic job of getting kills. So he's doing a good job in terms of being the secondary support player, but his entry rating is horrible. So clearly, he's either not being enabled or droned in enough on the entry, or he needs to be playing the secondary support because he's getting all of these kills, but they're not on an entry role. So maybe Napew is the real entry and Onigiri is the secondary entry. And if that's the case, then Onigiri needs to relax a little bit because he should not have this many entry engagements. Because clearly he's playing a secondary entry, but he's struggling mightily as an original entry. Everyone else on this team, honestly, kind of filling the role. The hard support player, leading the team in plants. You'd like to see a little more, but that's okay. And then you kind of have your flex player close to even here. Looking at Furia. And what I want to pay attention to is as we get higher and higher in the standings, is it more clear on kind of these enablers and the statistical players? That's what I want us to focus on. Does it become more clear what's good and bad about these teams? So for Furia, here we see Linda, Anyana, and Smoke. -13, 19 entry engagements. Rare, -6 overall on Habana. So this is going to be their hard support most likely. 10 plants, leading them in plants. Those are good numbers for a support player. We have highs, +8 on the flex, +12 entry. Miracle, +10 overall, -1 entry. Also kind of playing a secondary support. So I'd say Miracle and Rare are probably more of the support players. Then Fantasy, +11 overall. 75 entry engagements, -7. But that's okay because as we see already, Fantasy is being traded out. The issue you see here with Furia is that Linda, kind of on, I would say, this secondary entry role, is struggling statistically. When in reality, if Fantasy has 75 entry engagements and he's still going positive, somebody should have better stats than Fantasy trading him out. So this could be on fantasy for not playing with anybody to be traded on all these entry engagements, or it could be on Linda or highs even to potentially not be trading them as they should. But we do see the formula here. Your flex player slightly positive, your entry player, your best statistical player with a ton of entry engagements. The one outlier we see here is that Linda is not doing as good statistically as you'd hope, given that Linda seems to be a secondary entry player. And Miracle over kind of honestly compensating for Linda by going positive 10 on more support-oriented roles. We can head over to Space Station and Damwon now. We're on Damwon. You're going to see Katsang playing on the, I would say the flex at negative 11, but plus 6 in entry. Ren playing on the entry role, negative 7 overall, 39 entry engagements, but negative 7. Coded on the hard support role, 18 plants, negative 12, negative 4 entry. Yas on the entry role, plus 4, 47 entry engagements, negative 1. And Woogie Man, I would say also on flex, 7 plants, 6 clutches, plus 33 overall. And it's clear what the issue is here on this team. It doesn't really seem like the entries are being enabled. Their top frag is their support flex kind of player. Their flex player is their bottom fragger, although he is positive on entry. And then their entry player is negative 7 on entry, with their other entry player being negative 1. And while Yas might be trading off on this, Ren, using the outline that we've already set, Yas and Ren should be the 2 highest rated players. So you have Woogie Man kind of making up that difference, but not able to compensate for the production of the other team. And we see clearly Damwon struggling a lot on entry here. As a team, they have a ton of plants. They have 33 plants, I believe. 25. Yeah, they have over 30 plants in 14 rounds. So they're getting the objective work done. The problem is they're not getting the kills from the areas they need. They're missing that third player. Because if you want to say Woogie Man can fill the role of your main fragger, Yas can kind of be the flex, then you're saying that Ren or Katsang need to also be up here, and they're not. And that might be a case of enabling, because looking at their entry, they're all double-digit entry numbers. Typically, that's not how you see it. So Damwon, I would say, are not playing within the system of what we've deemed or what I've deemed as the best way to play. And then we can find Space Station. And we do see the enabler situation. We see Skies, negative 35, only 11 entry engagements, 29 plants. Bosco, negative 25, 41 entry engagements, 2 plants, 4 clutches. Hot and Cold, plus 15, plus 10 entry. Rampy, plus 17, negative 4 entry. Fultz, plus 6, plus 15 entry. So you have your 2 entries and your flex, your hard support, and then your secondary support. Now, honestly, the only thing I see here that kind of went wrong for Space Station is that Bosco is having a difficult time on the entry. Obviously, Rampy struggled a little bit on the entry too, but overall, these three's entry numbers is very good. The problem is that Bosco, playing kind of a secondary support role, not getting a lot of plants, was really struggling on the entry in this tournament, and that really hurt his numbers overall. Typically, Bosco doesn't play this poorly in terms of entry, and if he doesn't, he's going to be above Skies, and this is a kind of a perfect outline of what we talk about. We just have the outlier of Bosco having a bad tournament, and thus it costs them. So, now we're into the top 8, the big money, over $100,000, where we've got Dark Zero and OXG. Let's look at Dark Zero. NJR, plus 44, plus 9 on entry, 53 entry engagements. Panba, plus 30 overall, plus 16 on entry. Hyper, plus 3 overall, plus 2 on entry. Canadian, secondary support, negative 36, negative 8 on entry. Eclipse, main support, negative 2 overall, 23 plants. So what's the outlier here? Once again, it's going to be Troy. Similar to Space Station, the player in this kind of secondary role is doing much worse than what your support player really should be doing. Now, in the case of Dark Zero, Eclipse played so well that it kind of offsets almost, But then you go back to the fact that Canadian is also -8 on entry with only 3 plants. So what would you identify as the main issue for Dark Zero? Obviously, a top 8 finish is great, but what prevented them from doing better? You would say Canadian, he's kind of having a statistical outlier in that he should be performing better on this role. Or you could say Hyper should probably be performing a little bit better on this role, especially considering their 2 entry players played so well. But are they within the formula that we've talked about? Yes. And so far, we have both of the teams, Space Station and DZ from NA, playing within that kind of formula. So let's look at OXG. Yaga +3 on entry, +10 on, or +3 overall, +10 on entry. Laxing +19, +9 on entry. Fox on a support role. Yogg also playing support, so these are very good numbers, obviously. Look at the amount of plants. Even, +3 on entry. Kino, kind of on support, kind of on entry. 7 plants, -3 overall. Vertical, -17, -3 on entry. So when you look at their team, what becomes the outlier? Are they playing within the system? They are. They have their 2 support players. But the problem here with OXG is they're not playing to enable. Vertical is the worst performing player on their team, but he's typically their entry player. Yaga performed the best on their team as the entry player, but on some maps, clearly he was playing a support role, and Fox was middle of the pack while playing more of the support role as well. Kino plays smoke on defense and also secondary support on attack, gets a lot of plants. The outlier here to me is that Laxing is +19 on sort of he's mainly a flank watch kind of lurker role, doing this much better than Vertical. So it comes down to, was Vertical not being enabled because Lax and Fox are doing so well statistically? Or was Vertical just having a poor tournament? Statistically, you would say they fall within the system. Their entry player leads the way. Their secondary entry player is kind of not far behind. The issue is Vertical, as you know, their flex or maybe even their main entry on some maps really struggled. And thus, they only placed top 8, and I think some would say maybe even we're lucky to get top 8. So now we get into the top 6. We have the Sonics and Liquid. We have Liquid here, and they definitely play the enabler style. We have Palu and Nesk +54 and +42. The hard support players, -7 with 21 plants. Secondary support players, -10. Their flex players, +10. But clearly, they're doing a great job enabling Palu and Nesk. Everybody's really doing the job that they should. The only thing you would maybe say is Ask potentially had too many entry engagements. He had 42 entry engagements as a support player. I feel like that's a very high number. But overall, they are playing in this system. And then we go to the Sonics, where you have Grixer +90, Rexen +14. Then the flex players, -16, with 5 plants and 5 clutches. The secondary support players, -25, +10 on entry. And the support players, -65, with 14 entry engagements and 24 plants. Does this fall within the system? It definitely does. You have your main entry player, 56 entry engagements, secondary entry player, 41 entry engagements, your flex, 41 entry engagements, and then your roamer / secondary support, 10 entry engagements. Now, what could have gone better for the Sonics? Obviously, us 3, Kansan, Yeti, and myself, could have done better statistically in the overall KD. Yeti obviously had huge numbers in terms of entry, but as a team, we could have obviously gotten more close to the even number. But were we playing objectively? Yes, over 30 plants, a lot of clutches, and clearly we were playing very enabling play style. As you see here, we're all in the double negatives. We have 2 players who are +90 and +40, both double-digit entry. So is that the enabling play style? Definitely. So then we're heading to the top 4. MIBR and FaZe. Now, MIBR, they don't play the enabling play style, really. You could say maybe they do, but they're pretty even all across the board, very similar to Empire. Falls is their hard support player, -7, -13, only 25 entry engagements, 14 plants, and then you have Lucadera on entry, +25, Reduct on that secondary support role, +10, Elite Box on the secondary entry role, plus 14, and Wraps on Flex, plus 13. Some way, they're actually in the formula we've kind of talked about. The main difference here is that their secondary support player went plus 10 and plus 1 on entry, and that's probably what elevated them to top 4, is that they had one of their support players kind of overachieve on that role, and it boosted them up a bit. But are they in that area we talked about? Yes, we have their entry players, their top statistical performer, their secondary entry, their flex, and then here's what we talked about of their secondary support player, kind of boosting them up with their entry, with their support player on the bottom. So then we go look at phase. Phase, here we go. Their entry player leads the team in KD, plus 33. Cyber, secondary entry player. Lurker, second on the team. Souls, their hard support player, plus 13, negative 12 on entry. 26 plants. Bullet, entry player, secondary entry player, plus 27. And Cameraman, negative 37, negative 12. This is their IGL in secondary support. So in a way, phase are playing the exact same thing, but they do it in reverse, whereas Cameraman is playing an enabler role, and Souls is thriving, although he's on the hard support role. But as a team, they are still within the formula. They have their entry player, secondary entry player, flex. Well, I guess Cyber you could say is a flex. Bullet and Cyber, both kind of entry, both kind of flex. Souls, hard support, and Cameraman, secondary support. Now, Cameraman is the IGL for this team, so in a way, they're swapped, but it's still the same formula. They have one player who's kind of just negative, playing to enable. The others thriving off of that. The difference is Souls in this situation going absolutely crazy while also planting, and that makes up for Cameraman playing not necessarily support oriented, but struggling on the role. Does this formula still work? It does, because it follows the formula we've talked about. So then let's look at Empire. Empire, Shepard as their hard support player, plus 8. Always plus 16 on the flex roll. Joystick plus 20 with 78 entry engagements. Dan plus 13 with 72 entry engagements. Scyther plus 3 with 40 entry engagements. So here are your entries. Your flex, secondary support, and support. And Empire is very unique in the situation that they all are pretty close statistically. I would say they're probably, of all the top 6 teams, maybe even the top 8, the only team that doesn't really play within that system of having an entry, a secondary entry, a flex, a support, a secondary support. Because most teams, as we've seen, kind of have one player who's just going to be much more negative than everybody else, and that's enabling the others to thrive. Where Empire, they're very balanced. You know, none of the other teams are as balanced as Empire, which is probably why they're consistently so good. And then, obviously, we have the champions TSM. What do we notice? Geo on the hard support role, negative 56 with 33 plants. Chala on the secondary support role, negative 19 with 7 plants. And then Bolo, secondary entry. Merc, entry. Achieved, flex. Is that within the system? It most certainly is. Now, what maybe boosted TSM up? Their flex player going absolutely insane. Plus 63 on the flex. Merc also just plus 32, 92 entry engagements. Bolo, 98 entry engagements, plus 10. So once again, we see the formula. So the thing to look at here, and the thing that I'm curious about, is of the top 8 teams, Dark Zero, did they have the enabler? Were they led by their 2 fraggers? Yes. Dark Zero is within the formula. Liquid, were they within the formula? The negative support player, the negative or close to even secondary support player, the flex, and the 2 fraggers. Yes. TSM, absolutely yes. Phase, the enabler, the entries, the support, yes. In a reverse way almost. Souls and Cameraman kind of switch spots because Cameraman does the IGLing. Empire, no. Sonics, absolutely yes. Plus 90, plus 40. The enablers. MIBR, yes. Although I would say MIBR are almost to the point of Empire, where they're very even, but they have the support player enabling the entries. And as we talked about, part of the reason they achieved top 4 is because their secondary support player played above what the expectation of that role is. Are they within that system? They certainly are. And then we have OXG, where I would say OXG kind of are not within the system. They're just kind of a weird team. Their entry player leads the way. Their secondary entry player is on the bottom. Their lurker secondary support flank watch is second. Their entry player, their hard support's third. So the question is, after looking at all that, would you say that stats matter? Yes, they matter for 3 roles, clearly. Your entry, your second entry, and your flex. If those players are playing well enough, and your other 2 are enabling, your 2 supports, you can win the game. If one of them is not playing at an elite level, that's when you're not going to win, right? You would have to have somebody in the way of phase overachieving to match that result. Does your hard support player's stats really matter? And we'll call him an enabler in this situation. The answer, no. -36, top 8. -35, -25, 29 plants. -10, top 6. -7, top 6. -17, -3, top 6. -56, top 8. -56, -19, won the tournament. -37, third place. Empire doesn't fall into that. They're all just cyborgs. Sonics, -65, -25, top 6. MIBR, -7, top 4. So clearly, the support player going negative for your team is not make or break. What is make or break is your entry players getting entry engagements, coming out ahead in those. Your secondary entry players thriving off of the entry player, trading them, getting stats. Your flex player playing close to even, doing their job, getting some entry engagements, but not costing. So the question of, is there a correct or wrong way to play Siege is, of course, no. Any team can have any philosophy. Obviously, in terms of Empire, they're very balanced. But most of the teams here, you see playing within the same formula that we've discussed. They have an entry player, a second entry player, a flex, a support, a secondary support. The issue on some of the teams not placing high is that their entry players are either not being enabled to do as much as they need to, or their support players are not enabling them. The question is, how do you figure that out? A lot of the time, only the players on that team will know if they're being enabled, if their support players are doing that job, or if they're being left out to dry. So what do you think? Do you think stats matter? If stats matter, do they matter for everyone, or do they only matter for certain roles? When looking at this, what sticks out to you? Let me know. And also in the comments, let me know what you're looking for maybe next week or in 2 weeks. What kind of videos are you guys looking for? Thanks for hanging out. Stats don't matter unless you're an entry flex or second entry. Peace.